Hello, and thanks for being here today. We're going to talk about the governance of nature-based approaches to carbon dioxide removal. So, how do we manage to remove large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere using nature? And what this talk is going to cover is several of the big picture, high-level governance challenges of scaling up nature-based approaches to CDR, carbon dioxide removal. And then we'll talk about the existing frameworks that we already have that may govern some of these nature-based approaches. And finally, some of the current efforts to address these governance challenges. And so there's 6 big ones: social and environmental safeguards, capturing co-benefits, ensuring long-term storage and preventing leakage, monitoring, reporting, and verification, responsible incentivization, and avoiding mitigation deterrence. So possibly quite a bit of jargon in these words, but we're going to talk about what all of those things mean. Starting with social and environmental safeguards. So basically, safeguards measures to avoid risks, to make sure you're doing no harm with a project. And social safeguards are something that have been proposed and debated with REDD+, the framework for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. You can see an infographic with some of these safeguards here. They address things like making sure what you do is consistent with all the different laws, that it's transparent, that it respects the knowledge and rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, that everybody can participate in the project and the governance of it, and so on, that you're addressing the risks of reversals too as part of those safeguards. So you have the social safeguards and you have the environmental safeguards, because these goals about carbon removal have to be balanced with biodiversity and other environmental goals and also other community goals. And so these are challenges that go beyond just one particular international treaty or governance regime, right? It requires these different bodies that we have that work on these things to really coordinate and work together to make sure that the implementation of carbon removal using nature-based solutions at scale aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals. Second big challenge is capturing co-benefits. So there's a lot of talk about the different co-benefits that can come from nature-based approaches. For soil carbon sequestration, that might be something like larger yields or lower fertilizer and water costs, but that doesn't happen in every case. Similarly, with forest carbon, there could be community benefits like jobs and empowering women and biodiversity too. But again, not in every case, right? We can't assume that the co-benefits naturally follow implementation. The policy really needs to be designed to maximize them. And it's interesting that many projects have been done for the co-benefits first and the carbon benefits kind of as a bonus, a side effect from them. This one looms very big to me right now because of some of the wildfires we've been seeing where I'm from. The risk of release of stored carbon from a project activity back into the atmosphere as CO2 during the permanence period. So that's the UN's definition of permanence. So what could make this stored carbon release from a forest? Like I just mentioned, unfortunately, wildfire, but also pests and disease, and also harvesting. So if a piece of land becomes more valuable for the land than the carbon credits, the community might have a reason to harvest that land. So that's one huge challenge. Another one is leakage. So if you protect forests in one place, how do you know that it won't just mean that you clear land in some other place? For example, if you had a piece of land that was used to grow crops and then you do the forest carbon there, are you going to be clearing another piece of land nearby to grow those crops? And then there's monitoring, reporting, and verification. So this figure here is from one framework for soil carbon measuring, reporting, and verifying. And you can see that it's a very complex diagram, right? Because you've got remote sensing from satellites that are looking at different things. You've got sensors in the soil on the ground. You've got models that are helping you understand what's likely to happen with soil carbon. All of that just to understand the soil organic carbon change over time, which is something you need to do if there's going to be payments provided for soil carbon storage. But you need to integrate all this data, and that costs money. It's technically challenging. And so the costs of that make it difficult for some farmers to participate in forest soil carbon schemes because they need access to all of that, or a service that's providing that, and it needs to be reliable enough that whoever's buying these credits can trust it. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So there's a strong role for government here, I think, in supporting monitoring frameworks. And that's not just for soil carbon, that's also for forest carbon and other nature-based approaches. Then responsible incentivization. So what is that? Incentivization, referring to different payment schemes and policies for enabling and supporting nature-based approaches. The incentivization is needed, from the initial research and development to project financing to the scale up of these projects. So what makes an incentive responsible or irresponsible? It might be irresponsible if it's not in tune with the priorities of a community, or if it's not environmentally sustainable. What makes it responsible? There's some things like transparency, stakeholder involvement. You can look at Rob Bellamy's article about how to incentivize negative emissions responsibly. This is a big governance challenge as we start to set up incentives. And finally, avoiding mitigation deterrence. So would developing nature-based carbon removals as offsets allow for continued emissions and thus delay mitigation? Very important concern. And because of that, some analysts have suggested making separate targets for mitigation and for carbon removal, such as Duncan McLaren and colleagues, just to make sure that it's not just a purely offsetting dynamic. So let's turn now to talking about what some of the existing frameworks we have, how they might apply to nature-based carbon removal, starting with forestation, right? So that's something that there is a governance framework for to some degree, but it needs to be improved, right? So we have the UNFCCC, the building on the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. The FAO has been involved in this, but there's still questions around land use issues, and as well as monitoring and verification and so on. But this is something that is technically known about, still an active area of research, but could be scaled up quickly. In this section of the presentation, by the way, I'm drawing on C2G's evidence brief for governing nature-based solutions to carbon dioxide removal, which I encourage you all to check out. So a lot of states are including forestation in their nationally determined contributions. And there's been a lot of learning, I would say, over the past several years about how to deal with some of these things, how to improve models for forest carbon that take into account loss, thinking about liability schemes to deal with the permanence issues. But a lot more to do here, especially if we're going to be relying more on nature-based approaches for carbon removal. Soil carbon and biochar. Soil carbon is something that received more attention, I think, after the Paris Agreement and the 4 per meal initiative that was launched at that time, really got the research community talking about what would be needed for the monitoring, verification, and reporting of soil carbon sequestration. And I think this is one place where you also see the private sector really stepping up to think about how to get farmers paid for soil carbon. And biochar is something that I think maybe comparatively less discussed. And there's certainly things within the UNFCCC and work the FAO does that intersects this in terms of what's needed, that if there was a transboundary trade in biochar, there may be international agreement regarding the carbon credit allocation there. Macroalgae cultivation is something that there's not too much governance on, and because it depends a lot on where this macroalgae is grown, right? So obviously states have governance over their own coastal waters and their 200-mile exclusive economic zones, but what about projects for areas beyond national jurisdiction? As C2G notes, the FAO clearly would have a role here too. This seems a little bit farther out in time, but it's good to map out the landscape of all these things. Restoring wetlands, another really important one, because coastal wetlands are being lost at an incredible rate still, so protecting them is a first order of concern. There's some things regarding that. But what about blue carbon, the prospect of credits involved with wetlands and blue carbon? It's been discussed that the Ramsar Convention wetlands could play a role, Paris Agreement reporting requirements as well. But the governance here I might characterize as fairly, let's just say there's a lot of needs, especially with regards to stopping wetland loss, right? So what about all these governance challenges, the 6 big picture ones I've talked about here? How are they being addressed? I think that, with the Paris Agreement, we have this architecture for nation states, this bottom-up approach, nation states deciding what to do. And a lot of them are including nature-based approaches into their nationally determined contributions. And in doing so, kind of sketching out plans for governance there. And so you can see in this figure, it's a map from the IUCN's report on nature-based solutions in NDCs about the countries who have included different things in their NDCs. So figure A is nature-based solutions in the mitigation component. B is nature-based solutions in their adaptation components. And then synergies between mitigation and adaptation, less discussed, that's figure C. And then D, different quantitative adaptation targets. So they found in this analysis that 2/3 of the signatories include nature-based solutions in some form for mitigation and adaptation goals, but they note that really more concrete evidence-based targets are needed. And so this is an exciting time because this is all being worked out right now. I'll talk about one current effort because it has so many people involved, right? There's a lot of NGOs that are heavily involved right now. And this effort is to have a standard for nature-based solutions spearheaded by the IUCN. They're thinking about these different challenges, economic and social development, human health, food security, water security, to balance all of these. And then they have 8 criteria that make up this standard for nature-based solutions, with societal challenges in the center, going out to mainstreaming and sustainability. And basically, this is one tool that governments, planners, donors, and others can use to make sure that nature-based solutions yield desired outcomes. And I should mention here that their nature-based solutions have a broader definition, with climate change as just one part. But I suggest that nature-based approaches to carbon removal could be evaluated using this standard or one very similar, and I encourage you to check it out. So just to sum up, compared to other carbon removal techniques, nature-based approaches do have a lot of existing experience and partial patchy governance frameworks. The challenge is really making use of what we've learned from the expertise of the past several years. So that experience, for example, social justice concerns around forest carbon, monitoring challenges for both soil and forest carbon, et cetera, has highlighted what these are. We know what the challenges are. We're not naive about them anymore. And NGOs are really currently playing a major role in this space, both identifying these challenges and talking about ways to address them. And what I'm hoping to see in the next very near term is that states are also going to step up and work with them and with the private sector. So big challenges, but big opportunities. And I thank you all for your time in thinking about this today.